Storytime with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Storytime, where I get to talk to other writers about their passions and their processes. I am so excited about today's guest because I've already read his book and it's fantastic. And you guys at home are going to love it because it's up all of our alleys. It's art and it's Italy and it's all kinds of wonderful things. He is also an actor and a screenwriter and the novelist of other novels, including a young adult series called History Keepers and a novel called Tomorrow. But his latest is called The Color Storm, a novel of Renaissance Venice. Welcome to the show, Damian Dibben.
It's lovely to be here and talking to you in particular, as I'm also a huge fan.
Oh, thank you. Oh, good. Oh, good. Mutual admiration. Well, look, we both write, at least this book for you is about Renaissance Italy. And your previous book, Tomorrow, was also set in Venice. So we're obviously both Italy lovers and all that. I want to get to that. But first, I love Giorgione, the artist. I loved this book, but I don't want to butcher your plot on your behalf. Please tell my viewers at home a little bit about The Color Storm.
Yeah. So it's all, it's set in 1510 at the time, you know, when Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo and Giorgione obviously were all alive, all fighting for the same commissions. And our hero is Giorgione, and he hears of this pigment that's newly arrived in Venice, which is more a color more incredible than ultramarine, which had been the kind of star of the Renaissance up until that point. And in his quest to find it, he becomes entangled with a married couple, a merchant, an extremely wealthy man, and his young wife. And essentially, Giorgione plays a very dangerous game by trying to use them to try and locate this pigment. And all the while, all the other artists of the time, including Michelangelo, Raphael, Lorenzo Lotto, Bellini, Titian, have all descended on Venice, if they're not already there, also in search of this color. And just to make matters even more kind of precious regarding time, the plague is also kind of encroaching on the city.
It is a page turner. Like, I love historical fiction, but sometimes historical fiction gets a little too, history laden. And this has a lot of great history in it, but man, the pages moved. I loved it. My question is, Giorgione. I love Giorgione, but Giorgione is a little bit hidden in history, a little like we don't know a lot about. How did you decide Giorgione was going to be your guy?
Well, I mean, firstly, I found it very interesting to sort of tell that story through someone who was less known. So almost the people that you are much more familiar with, the Michelangelos and the Leonardos, and are there in the background. So it was just an interesting way of telling the story. But how I lighted on Giorgione, was very simple, because I had also been a fan. But I'd seen The Tempest in Venice and his Venus, but he was still quite in the periphery of my own mind. And then the Royal Academy in London put an exhibition on about 5 years ago, and I went to see it, and I thought, gosh, and that's where I learned that he was Bellini's student, and he in turn had Titian as his pupil. And he was this sort of immense figure in art. Some people say that he invented the landscape painting. He was certainly one of the first people to ever paint kind of a picture just for the mood of it, for the feel of it, for the atmosphere. Whereas the sort of Florentine school, the Michelangelos and Leonardos, it was very much always starting with a person. Always starting with a soul, and Giorgione is very much starting with the atmosphere and the mood and the what time of day it is and how it feels and how warm it is, and so this is sort of 350 years before Monet and the Impressionists, and you could really trace the starting point back to him. So I just thought it was incredible that he was this figure, but also that no one really knew anything about him. I mean, they'd mounted this exhibition at the Royal Academy, and literally all that is known, of all the books that I've read, is that he was tall, hence his name.
Big George.
Possibly striking looking, because there are some pictures that may or may not be self-portraits. I don't know if I've now invented this, but I see him as a very charismatic person. And we know when he died, precisely, because I think a week after his death, a patron, I think it was Isabella d'Este, tried to buy one of his paintings kind of on the cheap, and sort of got a letter from someone saying, well, actually, he's already passed away. But and we know that he came from this small village near Venice called Castelfranco, and that's really it. So it was wonderful to try and sort of flesh out the possibility of of the person that he became. And I obviously ended up falling in love with him, actually, in a way that I never have with a character of my own making before. I really I feel he's a friend for life, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely. I mean, I feel that way about my guys. They're that's how I feel. I feel like I got to hang out in a tavern with them for a while, and they're like my drinking buddies or something. I love them. That's interesting, though, that because you light up when you talk about this stuff. Like, you get as excited and lots of words and lots of stuff when you're talking about art history and you're talking about this stuff, as I do. And I always think I look like a freak when I'm talking about it because I'm so excited by it. And you fell in love with Giorgione in a way you hadn't with your previous characters. And yet, even though you have an art background and you're surrounded by art physically at the moment, like it's behind you, it's all around you.
There's a lot of it.
This is the first time that you've gone into art history, at least in the books you've published, right? I mean, so wait, what took you so long, and what made you finally make the leap into something that you obviously care a lot about?
I mean, yes, that's interesting. I mean, so in my previous book, Tomorrow, which is essentially about immortality, and there are three immortal figures. There are two brothers and the dog of one of them, and they've all lived for hundreds of years. And the story is actually narrated by the dog, who's called Tomorrow, and it's all about him trying to find his master, who he lost 150 years ago. And this other immortal character is his kind of nemesis. And in the research for that, I did obviously spend a certain amount of time in Venice, and these brothers kind of came. The backstory is they came into their own during the Renaissance, and it's where they kind of sparked their sort of love of life and learning, and that's what enabled them to, they were scientists, and they created this way to carry on living. And so that was the kind of starting point. That's what kind of set me off in this world. I thought I really now want to explore this world, because it's just so fascinating the way the workshops operated, the competition between the people, just the very fact that all these painters, who are all household names, maybe with the exception of Giorgione, were all alive at the same time. And I was just sort of overwhelmed, and I thought, well, now I just have to turn to this. But all the books I wrote, and the young adult series as well, the History Keepers, that's, it's very much, art is very much there, in that there's it's about the great people who kind of changed the world and who charted the world, the explorers, the artists, the navigators, the inventors. So they're all there in the background of all the books. But this one was, the Color Storm is specifically focusing on the how artists have changed the world and continue to change the world. But as you said, it's my upbringing you know, both my father and my stepfather were both. I mean, my stepfather's a straight painter. My father was more of a sort of, I don't know, creator of sort of magical things. That's the only way to explain it. And
This
I
is all
grew
coming
up.
out finally.
But also luckily grew up in a part of London where all the museums are, just by, you know, the V&A and the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, you know, not far from the Wallace collection, you know, the National Gallery, you know. So I was just in all these places all the time, and I always responded to everything I saw there. I mean, I'm sure it helped that my parents were encouraging of me, but it was more just everything I saw was a world opening up, and it could be just a piece of furniture, or it could be, you know, you know, a model of the first steam engine, but it's just suddenly seeing the sort of the wonders of the past. And or I guess all the individuals have really changed the world, just excited me so much from a young age.
Your series for young adults is History Keeper, so it's all about the great people who changed the world. Tomorrow is straddles a couple of time periods going back 150 years. This one's obviously historical fiction. So obviously you're a history nerd. Okay, fellow history nerd. I am obsessed with the stuff.
Yes.
But you made really interesting choices, I thought, between the real history, because the Color Storm is really steeped in very solid history, and you really get a sense, like you were talking about, of the workshops and the time period and the rivalries that are happening between all these different artists, and the importance of color and all that stuff. And yet I know a lot of it's straight fiction. I mean, because it is a page turner. We don't know these very exciting things about Giorgione. I mean, there is a good plot at the center of this.
Yeah.
How do you, I think every historical novelist answers this question all the time, but how do you navigate that for yourself? I think we all answer it in different ways. The balance between real history and fiction. Like, what do you think your job is? How do you personally navigate it?
I think, I mean, first and foremost, you know, you want a reader to turn to the next page. I mean, it's as simple as that. You want it to be exciting. And in a way, you know, because I worked for like 15 years, you know, as a screenwriter, and that is, you know, that's all about story. It's all about propulsion of story, and obviously character as story also. And, you know, everything's got to be there for a reason. It's got to, you know, it's got to have earned its place there, you know, almost every single word. So you know, my first job is to write something that's thrilling and entertaining. So that always comes first, but then, you know, you don't have to have one without the other, as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, I thought the idea of a sort of a search for a new color was a really sort of thrilling idea, and I actually thought of it in terms of, you know, kind of a Hitchcock type story, the way the thriller kind of evolves, especially with this kind of femme fatale at the center of it, and that comes first. But then when you realize, well, okay, this is the story I want to tell, this is the world I'm set in, now I'll go and make that world as real as it possibly can be. So you know, just to enhance that sense of excitement. I don't think you ever, and I'm sure you agree with this, you don't want to bog people down with unnecessary details. You know, I think some people, you know, maybe put their research is too much on the page. It's almost got to feel effortless. So it is that line. But as long as you're always thinking story, 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 but not cutting corners, not jumping to conclusions, you know, because it's very easy, if you've seen a lot of period dramas, you think, well, everyone, you know, you know, women always had chaperones, or they always did this, or they always did that. And actually, when you look into it, you know, a lot of those things are just not even true. But somehow, as a reader, if you're reading something, you know when it feels authentic, and you know, you don't know, you haven't particularly, you checked, you know, cross-checked, but you just have that feeling of like, oh yeah, that's probably what it would have been like. So, you know, I find it, I mean, that is the vast amount of work goes into that to make it almost seem like no work's gone into it, as if it's just sort of this effortless thing that you just know what Venice actually looked and sounded and smelt like in 1510, or what a, you know, who was, you know, what a workshop felt like at that time. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. But the other thing, you know, that I don't know how you feel about this, but I always, the term historical fiction, that always slightly, I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I understand why things have to be pigeonholed, but you know, if you think in terms of films, for example, I mean, you have, you know, Gladiator or Atonement or Gone with the Wind or whatever, or Titanic. You don't call them period films, you just call them films. I mean, they're stories. Do you see what I mean? The fact that they happen to be set in the past is immaterial. So I personally sort of slightly, I have difficulty with the term, but I also understand why it's there.
I love that you have difficulty with that term. I don't know that I've ever questioned it myself, because I grew up reading in the genre so much that I just always knew, oh, that's like the place in the bookstore or in the library
Right.
I want to go. So
Yeah.
I just took it. But you are right in that it's the same way I feel about women's fiction. You know, I'm like, it's just fiction. It's just stories. We don't have to categorize everything so neatly as sometimes the publishing.
But it's interesting, you know, because the novels that you know, the really big sort of breakout novels, I guess, like Wolf Hall and Hamnet, you know, the really sort of immense ones, you know, they somehow stop being thought of in those terms, and suddenly they're just thought of as novels rather than, you know, historical fiction novels. But you know, it's, you know, I shouldn't worry about it. But the only reason I have a concern is that I think there are some people who might be put off, you know. Some readers think, well, maybe it's not for them, because it sounds niche, when it isn't niche at all. It's very much not that.
I think it's our job as writers to have very strong opinions about random things that give us our point of view and the way we see the world. So I love it that you embrace that. Like, no, I'm not, this is not historical fiction. These are just great stories that happen to be, whether they're set in the past or the present or the future, it doesn't matter. You brought it up. So you brought up the Hollywood, which we have in common. I was a TV producer for almost 20 years out in Hollywood, and have written, I'm the same way. The reason why I care so much about story, about the forward movement of story, about that being my focus, is because I was a screenwriter for a very long time. And that is the focus of all movies. And I'm like, that's how you keep the page turning. I understand how screenwriting impacted your storytelling, but you were also an actor. How did acting, I'm also a trained actor. I love it. It's like, it's like one of my favorite hobby. Basically, I treat it like a hobby. I have never really done it professionally, but I love it. And I think it changes the way I tell stories a lot. How does it change the way you've told stories in your lifetime?
The acting specifically, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, it's almost too obvious to point out, but it's a sort of getting into characters' heads, you know, trying to work. I mean, obviously, your acting training is all about understanding why characters say the things they say, move the way they do, look how they do, react how they do, and you know, it's I'm sure you kind of acted out in your mind when you're writing. I mean, you become these characters, and it's the same. It's the sort of the escapism of that. It's a living, you know, living in someone's world, and it is, you know, you've got to be as rigorous about it when writing as you are as an actor. You really just have to remove your own opinions about it and just try and see it from that person's particular perspective. And yeah, I mean, it's helpful in that. The other way is helpful, which is probably not what you wanted the answer necessarily you were alluding to, is that I think you probably feel the same. I feel able. I mean, I'm actually quite an anxious person underneath it all, but somehow my training as an actor makes me able to come and talk to you, makes me able to go into a room full of 200 kids or whatever and talk to them, even though inside I'm just like falling apart. You sort of put on this persona, and I think that is invaluable.
When I was a kid, at least, I always thought of writers and actors as being two very different kinds of people. Like, writers were introverted and serious and thinking,
Yeah.
and actors were show offs and shallow. And,
Yeah.
sort of that idea
Yeah.
of actors as being just performers who just want attention. And what I've learned is the word escapism is what I love.
Yeah.
Is that they are both escape arts. That
Yeah.
we are all just trying to escape this world and go someplace else. Is that what initially drew you to storytelling? This idea of escapism, since you brought it up?
Yeah, but not because I was living in a kind of world of horror or anything. I have a very nice life, but I who doesn't want to travel? It's because that's what it is. I mean, you're traveling, you're seeing new places, you're experiencing new things. So you're not just doing it in geographically, like, but you're doing it through time. And that travel and escapism, it's one and the same thing to me. And why not give yourself that pleasure? And I find it so pleasurable, and I can just get it from looking at an object. You can go to the V&A and you can look at a chair or a kind of door or something, and it takes you, it transports you to another place. And I think the more places you can be transported to, the more, the richer your life becomes, in my opinion.
Are you also a big traveler? Because, like, returning to Venice is one of the most fascinating places I have ever been to in my entire life. And every time I go, I feel like there's something weirdly magical that happens. Like, there's just something in the water, I would say in the air, but I think it's in the water of Venice that makes it such an unusual, magical place.
Well, it's just preserved. I mean, it's it's one of the few places that is perfectly preserved, over sort of hundreds and hundreds of years. And you think it's going to be, because obviously there are so many tourists there and they have a problem, and I'm obviously one of the tourists. But it's so easy to get away from the crowds. And a lot of people don't realize that the crowds are all just focused in those kind of three spots and the kind of triangle between them. And you really, it's a time machine, and it is like no other city in the world. And I mean, just imagine the world without Venice. It would seem, it never stops giving.
I have to ask one last question. Because you have a couple of like these disappearing kind of stories. You have Giorgione chasing down a color. You have the great people from history. Do you know what it is that's like common in your, like, do you have a common thing that you're always poking at?
Well, I mean, it's funny because it's obviously, so the History Keepers, the young adult series, is all about this boy who finds out his parents are lost in history and he has to track them down. And then tomorrow is about a dog who lost his master 150 years ago, who he's also trying to track down, and all these stories take them through these incredible events and past incredible people. And it was actually only after about near to the end of writing tomorrow, because about this master, the sort of aura he has and what he, because he's a dog, describing him and what he smells like and what he looks like and the sort of the general feel of him. And I woke up one morning and I just realized, oh my God, it's actually my father. And who I lost when I was 17, and suddenly he literally was there one day and he just died suddenly. And it dawned on me, that has been the sort of propulsion for all this searching.
So you're always writing about lost things and trying to find them. The lost color in the color storm. I mean, there's a lot of like loss and searching in the color storm.
Yeah. And I think, obviously in the books, you can find these things, which you can't necessarily in real life, but you kind of do as well. It's really extraordinary. It's making me feel quite emotional now, but, my father, who, he died when I was essentially a grumpy teenager, and those 4 years before it happened, we didn't really, we just sort of argued, we didn't speak properly. And it's only since he's gone that I've realized, he was a believer in all these things that we're both talking about in art, and the transforming power of art and the transforming power of people. And so kind of writing about it is a way of kind of being reunited.
I've already kept you too long, but this conversation has been fantastic. I'm so obsessed with you. So now I'm gonna have to go back and read all of your books because I loved The Color Storm so much. So it's Venice, it's art. There's like page turning murder at the middle of it. It's fantastic. Just everybody home's gonna read it. They're gonna love it.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories.